Welcome back to Silicon Bison. Today we're going to ask the question, has Putin lost his mind, or is he behaving as he always behaves? A massive US investment, a facility in Ukraine, has been struck by Russian forces in a clear act of aggression against the US and its interests. We ask what signal is being sent by this action, clearly that was ordered by Vladimir Putin. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, all those who like and are subscribed and add comments to the videos. It's a massive, massive assistance. And of course, everyone who helps support the channel and its work through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It really is massively appreciated. Now let's jump into the episode. Moscow delivers a message to Trump with drones and explosions, trauma and terror. 2 nights ago, in the stillness before dawn, Russia hurled hundreds of drones and dozens of projectiles across Ukraine and hit an American-owned electronics plant in Mukachevo, far in the country's west, near the EU border. Inside were hundreds of workers sheltering in place. By morning, the factory, owned by Texas-based Singapore-registered Flex, was fully ablaze. This is an extraordinary act of aggression against US interests and investments. It's an attack on Europe too, and the concept of European security. For over 10 years, this is what Ukraine has had to get used to. Endless broken agreements by Russia, betrayals and deceptions. Every step towards peace and mediation is snuffed out by Russian violence. Now, slowly and hesitantly, the US is starting to understand. For Moscow, this is called business as usual. Unfortunately for the US and Donald Trump, it comes as a surprise and a shock, but really, it shouldn't. The strike on US interests also seems to have forced a shift in Trump's tone. For the first time ever, he posted that Ukraine must be allowed to fight back, and he laid the blame for Ukraine having its hands tied in fighting back for 3 years against Russia firmly at Biden's door. Well, this strike was no accident. We've been explaining for nearly 4 years how it is tactical, a psychological and instinctive reaction even, for Putin to lash out whenever he is forced to even hint at making a concession, or when he senses weakness and timidity in an adversary. He also lashes out when anyone shows anything that resembles kindness. Trump gifted him a huge PR win through the invitation to the Alaska summit, and that yielded huge results for Putin with no apparent results for the host nation, the US. And this is how Putin repays that gesture. We both fail to understand his actions and fail to predict them because our perception of what the Russians wanted is far from the reality of what Putin wanted out of that summit. And what did Putin want? Here's the full list, which I've been thinking about for a few days. Now we have a little bit of distance between that summit and some of the subsequent statements by Russian propagandists and media. Well, what I think above all Putin wanted was permission to continue the violence with no limit and no consequences. He wanted to get the threat of punitive sanctions lifted, and he achieved that. He wanted the deadlines for devastating punitive action to be fully lifted. Well, that's changed slightly today. Again, we're back to a 2-week warning. More of that in the next episode. Putin also wanted to move the agenda from peace and justice to purely transactional topics, to topics such as oil and minerals. But even these are used as manipulation. I don't think he's interested in oil deals and mineral deals in and of themselves unless they can help perpetuate his war machine. And the composition of the team that Putin sent to Alaska was clearly designed to cut deals or pretend to cut deals, not for the delivery of peace. Putin wanted to normalize Russia and himself on the world stage. He wanted to humiliate his hosts. This is signaling that Western US-led order is over, smashed, ruined, destroyed, never to return. And how does Putin think he can get away with this? Well, The answer is simple. He believes that he is backed by China. Putin also wanted to create a spectacle and material for a domestic audience, that is more distraction and deflection, and he did that entirely. You only have to look at the Russian coverage hailing this as a huge victory, this summit, to realize that that is one of the primary objectives of Putin in going to Alaska. He wanted to reassert that Russia is a global nuclear power, and of course he wanted to research the blackmail that is the core of Russia's strategy. They may not have a big economy, but they do carry a very big stick. He wanted to shift the perception of barriers and blockers being all about him, being all about the aggressor, and he wanted to shift that to the victim. That last one, this is a nice to have, not a need to have, and if he doesn't get it, I don't think that will deflect Putin from his other main priorities. From the very first moments of the Alaska summit, Putin and his team set out to deliver the optics of triumph and humiliation. Putin, with a huge grin plastered on his face throughout, even when the meetings were prematurely curtailed and the planned lunch cancelled, he was still grinning. He still wore that triumphal, smug grin. Well, what was said at the summit? What made Putin feel that he had won? And Lavrov arriving in the USSR t-shirt. Some of you will have seen the CCCP on his hoodie that he was wearing. Well, that was clearly mocking the hosts with that message. It was saying that we're back. Your nemesis has returned, you didn't fully defeat us, and like some kind of zombie vampire, we are back, and this time we own you. How should we read this? Putin is contemptuous of Trump. This much is clear and beyond dispute. And that message is reinforced by the array of propagandists working to a script drafted in the Kremlin. Beyond that, there are some options for how Putin thinks and what his attitudes toward Trump may be. Spoilers, respect is not included among them. Now these of course are speculative. We cannot get inside Putin's head. We cannot know exactly what he thinks, but there certainly is logic to suggest that some or maybe all of these may be true. Firstly, Putin thinks he owns Trump, potentially. Secondly, Putin thinks that Trump owes him favours. Well, this certainly seems to be the case. We rewind to what happened in Iran and the clear warnings that Trump gave to Russia so they could get their people and their equipment out before it was bombed. It also perhaps helped Iran remove a lot of the substantial nuclear material from that site. That has been speculated was Trump doing a massive favour for Putin. Now, whether Trump believes that he still owes Putin any favours and what those favours are owed for, that of course is a matter for speculation. Thirdly, Putin thinks that Trump is inconsequential. He doesn't have to keep him on side. Fourth, Putin believes that Trump will do nothing to push back against him and the violence that he inflicts. And finally, fifth, Putin believes he can divide the US from Europe and that both are too weak in any case to oppose him. Well, those are 5 options. Those are 5 things that Putin could be feeling and thinking, and there is some evidence from his actions that suggest one or more of those could be true. We need to also conclude from this what many of us already understood. Putin does not want peace, and he wants to sabotage any process that inches towards it. Furthermore, he wants to pin the blame for there not being peace on Ukraine and Zelensky, if he can get away with it. This is a nice to have rather than a need to have, as we suggested. Clearly, with yesterday's actions, clearly with the actions of 2 days ago in attacking a US facility, a factory in Ukraine, he is willing to jettison that objective for a higher ambition of humiliating and demeaning the US and its authority, particularly in the person of Trump. Putin is signaling that Western hegemony, and especially the era of the US as a global power, is over. And he wants to achieve this in the most direct and obvious way possible, humiliate the US on the world stage and suffer no consequences from that action. This is the only way Russia knows how to assert power, to demonstrate power, and to signal that power to its population and elites. It's a signal that the Siloviki understand without the need for any explanatory notes. Why, may you ask? Well, in yesterday's episode we explained how the power vertical in Russia is greased by theft and appropriation, but the structure itself is enforced through fear, power and humiliation. It's what keeps everyone in their so-called rightful places, and it's a dynamic which everyone in society understands, from the top to the bottom, from prisoners in the vast punitive system of camps to intelligence officers and mafiosi, to officers in the army, from oligarchs to beggars in the grounds of churches. What message is Putin trying to send? He orders a strike on US interests, with the factory workers still inside working on a night shift. Well, let's start with the facts that aren't in dispute. In one of the largest barrages of the war, Russia launched 574 drones and 40 missiles overnight, striking cities far from the front line, including Mukachevo in the Zakarpattia Oblast, where a Flex Limited facility was hit and set ablaze. Ukrainian officials reported 1 death in Lviv and at least 19 to 23 injuries tied to the Mukachevo strike alone, depending on which sources you read, including Ukrainska Pravda. President Volodymyr Zelensky posted it was a regular business, civilian business, supported by American investment, producing everyday items like coffee machines, and yet it was also a target for Russians. This is very telling. He said this on August 21st, 2025. The Washington Post characterized the Western Ukraine hits as rare and noteworthy, stressing how the Flex plant was an American-Singaporean firm and that the attack showed how Russia was not interested in peace. That is a summary of Zelensky's remarks. For those who don't know Flex, it's one of the world's largest contract electronics manufacturers, circuit boards to coffee machines, and a major employer in Mukachevo. City officials say the enterprise provides work for thousands of residents. That's according to the Washington Post, August 21st, 2025. As stated before, this was no accident. Mukachevo is a location on the western edge of Ukraine. Multiple outlets reported this as the first Russian strike on that city since 2022 and emphasized the plant's civilian output. There's nothing accidental about this. The message wasn't a military one. It was political, it was financial, it was psychological. American money is fair game, it screamed. That's in the Kiev Independent, August 21st, 2025. Hitting Mukachevo, a border logistics hub, signals two things. First, Russia wants to remind Western capitals that distance doesn't mean safety. EU adjacent does not mean risk-free. Second, by torching a US-owned facility amid the ongoing work on peace in Washington, Moscow is broadcasting contempt for the very assumptions of good faith talks. Putin is also emphasizing that peace will be on Moscow's terms, or there will be no peace at all. As the Washington Post puts it, the strikes came days after 2 summits chaired by President Donald Trump were meant to resolve the war. The Washington Post, August 21st, 2025. And these actions by Russia seem to have prompted a change in Trump's tone. He now implies that Ukraine should be allowed to fight back. Into this chaos, Donald Trump posted a message that sounded different, substantially different from anything he has written before. It's like a great team in sports, he wrote, that has a fantastic defense but is not allowed to play offense. There is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. We can be sure that Trump did not make this up himself, but it sounds like the kind of narrative that may have been crafted for him to help him better understand the reality, and likely it was repeated ad nauseum to him so that he could comprehend and internalize the lesson. He went on, crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. That's a Truth Social post quoted by the Washington Post, August 21st, 2025. Sky News summarized the same post and tone. Trump criticized Biden for not letting Ukraine fight back, comparing Ukraine to a great team in sports. That is not how he sounded a week ago when ceasefire talks and a quick handshake photo op dominated the Alaska storyline. Now it's let them hit back, while Reuters 2 days earlier quoted him ruling out US ground troops but keeping the door open to air support as part of any security assistance deal. That's reported in Reuters August 19th. So this is less a pivot from Trump, it's more of a Damascene conversion, it seems. Blaming Biden, well, that's not really a shock. And in this case, the argument is not without some merit. Biden and Sullivan did hold Ukraine back significantly, despite the amount of munitions that they sent, when it could have gone on the offensive with the right equipment at scale. But Trump suggesting that he could back Ukraine, probably via Europe or getting Europe to foot the bill to allow Ukraine to strike back, is totally new. And in fact, the very idea that Ukraine could have been victorious if it had not been held back is a revolutionary concept from this administration, and it's a complete transformation compared to his previous perception, again just a few days ago, that Russia could never be beaten under any scenario. Moscow's line that Kiev is blocking peace and why it's a bad faith script. As Anne Applebaum recently explained on DW, many leaders in the West, not only Trump, imagine that there is a deal that can be done with Putin, and they simply don't understand the extremism of Putinism. They think that if the right formula can be found, the right concessions made, the right words can be expressed, then that will unlock some magical and conclusive peace process. I must break it to them. There is no such formulation. Putin wants to erase Ukraine and Ukrainians and wants no limitations placed on his actions towards achieving that end. Everything else is just distraction, deflection, and dissembling. Russia ran 2 talking points today. First, that it struck military and energy infrastructure, and second, that Ukraine, not Moscow, is sabotaging peace. Reuters captured the Kremlin's spin. Ukraine was trying to undermine Trump's efforts, and Zelensky was illegitimate. Well, that is the tone of the Moscow propaganda. It is, of course, ludicrous. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov then insisted that Moscow is ready for an honest talk on security guarantees, while slamming Europe's discussions that exclude Russia as adventurism. That's reported in Reuters, August 21st, 2025. Further, Lavrov called European talks a road to nowhere. But what this strike on US interests in Ukraine says about Russia's aims. Concessions invite aggression. Weakness encourages Russian violence. Reuters, reporting, citing sources familiar with top-level Kremlin thinking, says that Putin's core demands include Ukraine give up all of Donbass and renounce NATO, that it stays completely neutral and forbids any Western troops on Ukrainian soil, reported by Reuters August 23rd. These are not proposals, they're ultimatums, and they completely undermine the very idea of providing any security to Ukraine. The head of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, Andy Hunder, spoke with reporters from the site of the strike. His verdict is damning and blistering. Russia is not only destroying Ukraine, he says, it is undermining US leadership, values, and US business. Russia is humiliating us. We're calling on President Donald Trump to stand with American business in Ukraine. That's from the Sky News live blog, August 21st. Hunter read this strike as a test of the US president's will. The Washington Post added that Zelensky's policy ask was, if Putin refuses a meeting, Kiev wants a strong reaction from the United States, including secondary sanctions and tariffs on those trading with Russia, which is precisely why deterrence must be credible and it must impose a significant cost to the aggressor. Meanwhile, US and European planners have been sketching military options and post-conflict security guarantees, but Moscow is publicly mocking the process. They do not believe that we are serious. and the evidence since February 2022 suggests that we are not serious about a victory over Russia. Lavrov has said that European security talks that exclude Russia are a road to nowhere, and claims that the best guarantees are those hashed out in Istanbul in 2022. Let's remind ourselves of what those are. That is, Ukrainian neutrality policed by P5 guarantors. One of those includes Russia. But the Istanbul measures would have imposed not only neutrality on Ukraine, but forced it to disarm and become vulnerable to renewed attack by Russia. Reverting to this, while saying that Russia be one of the guarantors of Ukraine's security, is not only absurd, it is also a sick joke, a mockery of justice. The Kremlin wants to undermine the peace process by calling into doubt Zelensky's legitimacy. This is not the language of a government preparing its public for compromise, but rather one intent upon escalation at any cost, and one preparing for endless war until certain objectives are met. We've gone from a minerals deal being touted as offering some kind of protection and security for a future Ukraine, to seeing that Russia will hit whatever it wants, whenever it wants. If economics were a deterrent, then frankly Putin would not have started this war in 2022 and threatened a break with the core markets for his hydrocarbon exports, namely Europe. The economic argument, the argument that having investments in Ukraine provides security, have now been completely blown out of the water. Deterrence must be a mix of capability, credibility, and real costed actions and costs imposed on the aggressor. Capability means things like more air defences for Western Ukraine, closing the skies to prevent strikes, plus enabling Ukraine to have more strike options against launch sites and Russian logistics. Credibility means setting clear, red lines with strong and immediate enforcement, not just words and deadlines that are never followed up on. Cost imposition on the aggressor, such as secondary sanctions on oil, dual-use tech, shipping insurance, targeted tariffs, and coordinated energy measures that starve Russia's war machine. These are tools that Zelensky explicitly asked the US to consider. That's in the Washington Post, August 21st. And finally, costed force, a demonstration that we in the West, especially in Europe, that we can commit the resources required to implement our threats and enforce the red lines that we define. Russia must be able to see the investment we are making and how that translates into credible deployed force. Hitting a giant US factory in Ukraine is not a mistake. Targeting the largest civilian investment of the US in Ukraine is not accidental, not in any way at all. It's a message. Putin is telling the Americans and Trump that he does not fear them and will do whatever he pleases. Putin is signaling that the American century is over. Their period of setting the rules and global hegemony is being challenged, and they have been found wanting. Humiliation. Unless our leaders understand that humiliation is at the core of Russian actions, fear, control, and humiliation, they will still cling to the notion that a deal is possible. This allows them to defer decision-making and hard choices. This allows them to put off having tough communications and conversations with their populations, and everything drags on and on and on. The minute they acknowledge that Putin does not want peace, that peace does not align with any of his global geopolitical objectives or the survival of his regime, then things suddenly change. Then they would need to create a plan to push Russia back across its borders, contain the threat it poses, and turn Ukraine into a steel porcupine. An impenetrable frontier between democracy and rule of law states and the lawless, parasitical tyranny that Putin's Russia represents.